I'm Liz Sumner, and this is I Always Wanted To, the podcast where I interview people who are doing things that others long to do. What have you always wanted to try? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today, I'm speaking with two women I admire greatly. Poet and artist Lynn Horsky of Boxborough, Massachusetts, and poet and teacher Halina Scharf of Ripalta in Le Marche, Italy. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Liz.
I have invited you both here to talk about getting your work out into the world. My belief is that there are many people who write poetry in private, but may hesitate to share it with other people. And I know that you both have made that transition into making your work public. And I think your experiences will be valuable to others. So tell me, how did you get started? Lynn, let's begin with you.
Fortunately, I was in a community of artists and poets here in the small villages of New England. And I met a woman who was a poet who began a Plein poetry group. She started this group and invited me to participate. And because I have a background in graphic design, I was able to become the publisher of our literary venture. Mm-hmm. And so we've been doing that for 6 years. And we walk around the farm. We get a theme each year. And this has been a great structure for me to write more poetry and have some type of goal that gets me inspired each year. And we only write 1 or 2 poems then, but because of the momentum, I've been able to write more, and that's been a real blessing. So community support and a do-it-yourself attitude. We since then wrote grants, and we get community grants from the local cultural council for our work. And so that's been really, and not a lot of money, but it does pay for the printing and a little bit of money for editing and layout. Mm-hmm. So it's just a great way to get a public audience. And that's kind of broken the ice. I'm more willing to go to poetry readings and read my poetry. So that's also been a real helpful thing.
So you didn't do the poetry slams and stuff like that before you started working with the group at
Oh, that's true. I did a lot of poetry slams prior to this. Yeah, in Cambridge, there's a lot of clubs that do spoken word performance poetry, and I did participate a lot in those because they were really exciting, and there was a lot of youth and, a fertile ground for growth and expansion with, hearing how other people express themselves. And it was much more of a dramatic, biographical form of poetry. And since my poetry is a little bit more inward or sound and sense oriented, it was kind of a transition to go into the oral spoken word from the written analytical kind of editing that I grew up with. It was a real growth experience to do that, and it did get me to be more confident.
I'm going to probe further, but let's turn to Halina and tell us, Halina, how you got started.
I'm not quite sure of the question. How I got started in poetry, always written poetry. As far as putting it out in the world is concerned, I think you'd probably describe me as hermetically sealed. I didn't share my poetry with anybody, not even my husband, my partner of 40 years, and except for perhaps one or two. But he knew I was writing, and that's about it, really. And I kept it for myself, and I justified keeping it to myself, saying this is purely cathartic. I don't need an audience. Thank you very much. I'm fine. And basically, I suppose, about 8 years ago, and I was in my mid-50s, and I really cannot remember, I wish I could for your audience, I cannot remember who suggested YouTube, and that there were sites on YouTube where people were recording their poetry, recording themselves reading their poetry, and putting the actual text of the poetry out. And I thought, why not? And it wasn't this sudden urge to be public. It wasn't an urge to publish. It was just something to do, something different, a little experiment, a little bit of fun. And so we started filming me in my kitchen, surrounded by all the kitchen utensils and mess, reading my poetry, which I can never remember by heart, from my handwritten texts. And we put it out on YouTube. I was extraordinarily lucky. There was a chap also writing and reading his poetry on the same YouTube site, who was acting as kind of protector, godfather for all new people coming onto the site, and promoted their work and got people who were coming to the site to look at poetry and read it, to look at my work as well. And he helped me get an audience. And he was living in Seattle.
Is he still doing this kind of work on YouTube?
I don't know, is the answer. I really don't know. He may well be, name's David, I can't remember his surname, but he may well not be. He was a little bit volatile in the sense that he drank a lot. I actually sent him a bottle of whiskey for his birthday once, all the way to Seattle, and it arrived, and he took a film of himself reading a poem one morning and drinking the bottle of whiskey, which was lovely, absolutely lovely. But it is a little bit worrying at the same time, so I can't say that he's still there.
Okay. So it sounds as though, Halina, you had a clear starting point about when you felt comfortable sharing your poetry. Was there a clear one for you, Lynn, or are you just a person who has the confidence to put yourself out into the world?
Well, I'm not all that confident at performing, but a short poem or reading my poem, I was willing to project my persona as a poet. So I've written poetry all my life as well, and really a lot in high school, and never thought about performing it, but I had a bit of rabble-rousing sentiments at a certain time in history. Not that I don't anymore, but and that kind of propelled me into the arena. So my subject matter at the time got me into the poetry slam world. I really been pursuing my visual arts now that I'm just working part-time.
So where did you find venues? Where, Lynn, you live near a large metropolitan area, and I'm sure that Cambridge is fairly kind to poets. But Halina, were you weren't in London at the time, were you?
No, we were living in the countryside outside London on a farm, which we were also running, a livestock farm. And I knew perhaps 2 neighbours who were also farmers. I daren't even begin to ask them whether they were interested in poetry. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But I think some people will understand what I mean. And I was probably prejudiced in thinking that. But no, through the YouTube site, I linked up with another poet or 2 in London who were doing karaoke poetry in at venues in London, and I partook in that and met them. And my son came along to a couple of them. That was really gratifying. And he was really supportive and very surprised. It's difficult because my poetry doesn't really communicate easily verbally. And it's not like rap, which is immediately attractive. It's a wonderful format, which I can't do, but it's immediately attractive to audiences in cosmopolitan areas, I think perhaps particularly. But I didn't have a problem facing the audience. I didn't have a problem with their polite patience whilst I was performing. And I didn't do it very often. I did it once or twice. It was the experience more than anything else. The biggest satisfaction I think I can say that I got was linking up with another female poet in California who was writing poetry, wonderful poetry, of a genre not dissimilar to mine. And I really admired her work and told her so. And fortunately, she had to make a trip to England, another part of England, but we met up and I met her family. And then she came to visit our farm. And when we moved to Italy, she also came to visit us here in Italy with a friend of hers. I'm planning a trip to California actually in the next 2 or 3 years, and I hope to visit her then there. And we send emails to each other very occasionally as well now, just saying, you know, where are you on YouTube? What are you doing? Why aren't you writing more? And just trying to, you know, kick each other up the backside basically about writing and give each other a boost. And that is quite amazing. I call her my virtual friend. People say, oh, virtual friends, you know, it's all a bit weird and dangerous. But this was just marriage made in heaven, really.
That inspires me to want to get on YouTube.
Yes.
Yeah, so what would you say to somebody about the value of having a community of other poets?
Well, it's been invaluable to me. I'm also volunteering with a group. Robert Creeley, who was a famous American poet, grew up in the small town next to me. And we have a foundation that every year we pick a nationally known poet or internationally known poet to get the Robert Creeley Award. And we have an event where we work with high school poets, and I just published a book of poetry for that the high schools, about 35 to 40 high school students all over the state of Massachusetts enter, and We do reading and we judge the poetry and we hone it down to 8 finalists, and then we publish all their poetry, and 1 or 2 tie. This year we had a tie, but 1 or 2 get chosen for the student award. And so that's been a really great sharing, because we share our poetry with the high school kids, and the poet that comes, the nationally known poet. We had Mark Doty here this year, comes and he reads to the high school, and they have a workshop, and he selects books for the library. So that's another community kind of event that keeps me interested in poetry and community. So yeah, there's many ways of supporting each other in the arts, which is, the little grants we get are so minuscule. They come from the lottery here in Massachusetts. But at least there's a little bit of reward we can give the kids to inspire them to continue on with their poetry. And
That's really encouraging to hear how that poetry is alive and well in your region. I think of it as something which, certainly in the U.S. education system, it might tend to get lost.
Yeah. I think in New England, because of our background with many famous poets here in various generations, makes kind of a difference in all the colleges here.
Oh yeah, of course.
So there's interest. Yeah, there is a kind of a revival of interest in poetry here, which makes, with the little clubs, with the poetry slams, and also at open mics where people play music and folk music, they also have poetry. So sometimes my husband and I go, and he plays the guitar, and then I'll read one of my poems.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Halina, how about you? What's your experience been about having a community of other poets? I mean, what would you recommend to others to know about having a community of other poets?
I must say I am quite envious of Lynn and her community, and in awe of the input that she puts into it as well. But I have to say that teaching, can I go to teaching? And because teaching poetry, I found in Britain, in my experience, and obviously it's very limited, teachers tended to shy away from teaching poetry. They were afraid of it. Perhaps they hadn't been taught well. I've taught children who the first thing they will say to me is, well, miss, you do realize we hate poetry. And you battle against that attitude. I love teaching poetry. I encourage the teaching of poetry. I encourage children to read it, write it. And since I've been since the YouTube experience, I've no fear of introducing my own poetry to children and saying, look, I can do this, you can do it too.
Wow.
I've no fear now of sharing my poetry with my friends. So I'm not looking for big audiences, but just if you can touch 1, 2 people and encourage them to read more poetry and perhaps even write some, then, it's micro science, if you like, as opposed to macro science. And that gives me a great deal of pleasure. And I have encouraged children to write. I worked for an organization in England called the Hospital School Service, where I went out to children's homes to teach them individually because they weren't well enough for whatever reason to go to school. And I always got this, we hate poetry. Never put me off. And I can say to a man, they were all writing poetry at the end of my period with them. And I see, every time I take on a new student, a new class, I see it as my duty, I suppose. I was going to say my goal. No, it's not my goal, it's my duty to infuse them about poetry of all ages and all types, and to get them to write their own as well. And it's not difficult. It's not a difficult barrier to break. And once kids have got through it, they are amazing. They're just amazing.
That is wonderful. I'm really inspired to hear you both talking about this. What else would you tell somebody who was timid? People who are, oh no, I could never do that. What words do you have for them? I'll start with you, Lynn.
Well, step across the void. I think that each person has a wonderful story and a signature and voice of their own. And I just encourage self-expression in any way as a release from kind of the everydayness of life, and to be able to step outside and get some fresh air. Mm-hmm. I don't know how else to encourage people to be bold and to find, to do what they want to do, even though it's a struggle and a challenge to do so, because it's so rewarding to have the freedom once you gain some skills at it, and the pleasure you can have in framing your thoughts. And, a lot of times writing poetry, I will just spew out onto the page, just write, like automatic writing. And then I go back and hone, what is it that I am really trying to say, and how to get that kernel, and how to shape it, and how to actually say it so that it's understandable and it crosses over into the universal,
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's, everybody has their ways of writing. I actually I never took a course in writing poetry, but I took a course in reading poetry. And I have several favorite poets that resonated with me, their rhythm, their sentiments. So reading a lot of poetry is also a wonderful way of learning. So
I'm going to come back to you about your favorite poets in just a second, but Halina, do you want to say anything to somebody who might be timid?
Yeah, for me, one of the most inspiring things was a quote from Ian McEwan. He was being interviewed about something he'd written in a book, and the interviewer said, well, what does this mean? And he said, well, I just write the novels. It's up to my reader to decide what it means. That's their job. Fine, that suits me very well indeed. Thank you very much. Don't worry about what you've written. You've written it. It's yours. Mm-hmm. You own it. But every reader will take from it what they want. And just an example of what readers might want from your work, and also as an example of, don't be afraid of anything, because it really nobody can harm you just because you've written a poem in any way, really. I wrote a poem called Rain Woman, which I put out on YouTube, and it happened to mention Wellington boots. Well, I suddenly started getting hundreds of hits from men in Asia and the Far East. And it wasn't until somebody quite savvy, much more savvy than I ever was, pointed out to me that it was all to do with the Wellington boots. Yes, it's a bit mind-blowing, but it didn't hurt me. I felt no pain, and nobody was stalking me physically. That's fine. I can live with that.
That's great. So back to you, Lynn, on favorite poets. Who would you recommend that somebody begin with?
Well, I'm an American, so I was raised on, I love Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I love Emily Dickinson for her experimental way of writing and her twists, her ironic twists. And I love Theodore Retke, who is a poet, a modern poet from the West Coast, from Washington, who had a very close connection with nature. And his father ran a greenhouse, and he had lots of observations, deep observations and metaphors about nature. And I loved the rhyme and the rhythm of his writing. And then I wanted to read a lot of female poets, and Anne Sexton, who was a kind of a crazy lady, but she wrote great poetry, deep, Jungian type poetry of her troubled psyche. And she also used fairy tales as vehicles to express her own coming of age and coming of consciousness. And then I loved Gary Snyder, who is a kind of a beat poet. And he was a Zen Buddhist follower and a nature person who lived up in the mountains. And I love his poetry. It's very sparse and very Japanese. Mm-hmm. I followed the beats when I was in high school and read, all the novels of Kerouac, and Ginsberg was also a real beacon of light in my youth.
Halina, how about you? Want to mention a few favorites?
Yes, I could reel off a list. Poetry is kind of like a professional thing for me. So, I have to admit it, I actually don't read a lot of poetry on my own. But, I do have favorites. I like Dylan Thomas. I like Philip Larkin. I like, let's be American, Sylvia Plath. But, I don't want to reel off lists. I would say, yes, you need to have some sort of background in reading poetry and understanding the basics of how it's put together and knowing some of the great poets. And I think that's actually quite important. But I see poetry in everything. Mm. And, when I'm reading novels, there's poetry there sometimes. There can be poetry in a newspaper article sometimes. There can be poetry in some graffiti sometimes. And to be very mundane and banal, when sometimes I come across parents of children who don't read very much. Mm-hmm. And they say to me, what can I do to encourage my child to read? And I say, get them to read anything. It doesn't matter. It can be the back of the cornflakes packet at the breakfast table. Just get them reading. Poetry is all about words, and words are everywhere. Mm-hmm. And they will start cropping up in your face once you become aware, and it's that awareness that you need to click into, as perhaps having your favorite color. Your favorite color is blue, and suddenly you see the blue everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I would say, don't worry about not being educated in poetry. Just begin to be aware of the power and the value of words and putting words together and seeing them everywhere.
That's fabulous. It's really inspiring to hear the passion that both of you express when you're talking about the poetry. Ladies, I thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. I think this is going to be very valuable to anybody who's been thinking about putting their work into the world. I'm Liz Sumner, reminding everybody out there to be bold, and thanks for listening.